are so excited to begin our series with Louise Baigelman, founder and CEO of Storyshares. Storyshares is a Boston-based literacy platform dedicated to supporting and empowering striving readers in grades 3 through 12 while creating and publishing books that meet at the intersection of interest and ability. As an English teacher at Kipp Academy in Lynn, Massachusetts, Louise led the ELL, or English Language Learner Program, and taught reading and writing to middle school students. She was also a member of the Charter Corps of Teach for America Boston and worked as a literacy coach in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, and as an after-school writing teacher in Palo Alto, California. So like many of us, parents, librarians, and educators alike, Louise saw a need providing diverse and relevant books to older striving readers, and she created a path to meet that need. And with that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you so much, Beth, and thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone for joining. I'm excited to be here. I'm going to share my screen, and then I'm also going to introduce Shira from my team, who will be co-presenting with me. So great, so excited to be here and for the chance to talk to you all about empowering older striving readers, students who are still learning to read beyond the traditional age of focus with books that are relevant and engaging and accessible for them wherever they are. And so Shira from my team at Storyshares is there. And she is the Chief Academic Officer. She's also a Wilson Certified Dyslexia Practitioner and Curriculum Creator. And she's passionate about culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy, social justice through literacy, and educating the whole child. She, like me, started as a teacher in middle school as a humanities teacher and noticed that many of her brilliant students struggled with sounding out single syllable words. And so that led her on this journey to think about how do we address this challenge of older students who are still working on those foundational literacy skills, and how do we empower and support them. So we're excited, two of us, to be able to chat with you today. We're going to, oh yeah, sorry, I'm often not a good multitasker. So there we are, Louise and Shira. We're going to do a quick intro, and then we're going to talk about literacy for students beyond the traditional age of learning to read and the challenge it creates and the current state of that in this country and globally today. And then the approach we have at Storyshares for addressing it. And then we're going to spend some time talking about a few of the key areas where there's research that we've brought together and thinking about how to really center older students and engaging text to make sure that we're not leaving behind those readers who haven't yet developed the skills or the love of reading because of some of the gaps they have in their early skills. So we'll talk about the science of reading, and then also the power of choice and practice and a reader's identity. And then we're also going to go a little deeper on decodable books for older students, decodable books for students in grades 3 through 12, and what they are, how to choose them, and also how to leverage them to engage and inspire students at any age to not only strengthen their literacy skills, but also to develop a love of reading. So we have a little opening reflection. If anyone wants to, in the chat, just share 1 to 2 questions or thoughts that you have about literacy or books for students who are still learning to read in grades 3 through 12. So, and you can share this now. I'll pause for like 15 seconds, but you also, you know, if you're like me, you might be a think time person. So if it comes up along the way, you can throw that in at any point. And it's helpful for us because that way we can try to address it as we go, or at least emphasize relevant content that relates to your questions. And if not, we can definitely follow up at the end or even after this to make sure we've touched on everything you're wondering about and are interested in learning about. So I'll pause for, just a few seconds. Shira, you usually do the timekeeping for this. Is that enough time or should I? Okay. Okay. Feel free to add in questions along the way. We love to hear what you're thinking and what you'd like to know more. So we will dive right in. So just as a quick overview of our goals for this session, we want to deepen your understanding of decodable text more broadly, but specifically what it means to have decodable texts for older students. Typically decodable texts are for those early readers in kindergarten, first grade, second grade. And so what does it mean to be a decodable text for an older student? And how do you leverage them to empower those students to strengthen their skills? And then also we want to share with you some of the key research and best practices around supporting older students to find books that really speak to them and to use those as tools that they can start to develop into readers. Because a lot of times if you're not decoding by the time you reach middle school, for example, you don't have very positive associations with reading. And so it adds an extra layer that, for parents and librarians and teachers, is sometimes challenging, but definitely conquerable. So those are our goals. I actually can't see this chat, so anyone else, like Shira, Beth, Marion, if there's anything that seems pressing, you can just call it out. Shira, yeah.
Yeah, I think something that I'm seeing in the chat, which was emphasized by other folks, is finding books that older students want to read that aren't baby books, which we will definitely touch on. We'll do more than touch on it. That will be a core focus because it's a core focus of what Storyshares does. And then Kate just put in discovering ways that community education organizations like museums can support literacy, which is such a powerful question. We talk a lot about how every teacher is a teacher of literacy when we talk about interdisciplinary literacy, but I think that that applies tenfold when we look at how every institution is an institution of literacy as well.
Yeah, love that. And so remind me if we don't circle back on that to address it by the end, because that's one of the pieces we talk a lot about, which is, literacy and reading, as we all know here, factors into absolutely everything. And there are so many different ways that you can tackle it in different contexts. So we'll talk a little bit about what we've done there, but also I love the museum context. So yes, and the baby book question is perfect lead into this first slide. So yeah, Storyshares, I started Storyshares initially after being a middle school teacher and working with students who were reading very far below grade level. Many of them had parents who couldn't read or, were newcomers to the country or had, learning differences like dyslexia, whatever the reason, they were, fifth, sixth, seventh, in this case, Jade, ninth graders reading anywhere from a kindergarten to a third grade level. And for me as a teacher, it was such a huge barrier that I couldn't offer them. I couldn't find books to offer them that met them at their intersection of age or interest and skill level, reading level. So I knew that a student like Jade would never be excited or even willing to read a book like My Fluffy Bunny, right? If you think about yourself at that age, of course, not only are you not interested in it, it's embarrassing, it's stigmatizing, it's babyish. And yet the books that were intended for that age, for older students, were just far too difficult for so many of my students to access. And I had many students who would rather pretend they could read a book that looked like the books their peers were reading than be seen reading a book that looks like this. And I have a daughter who just finished kindergarten, right? This is what a typical decodable book looks like, and for her it's thrilling because she can figure out the words and she feels accomplished and she's not very self-aware yet. But if you give this book to a middle schooler or a high schooler, of course they don't want to read that. And so I couldn't find books at the time that I could offer my students that they could read and wanted to read. And I felt like if they didn't find books to read and spend time reading, how could they improve their literacy skills. And I also was seeing the impact of this across every single class, because in science, they had to read the, text in their textbooks, or in social studies, they had to read articles in order to engage with the grade level content. And so without literacy skills, it felt like their opportunities were going to become further and further limited. And so I started Storyshares as a way to think about, how do we make content that's really engaging for students at any intersection of interest and skill level, so that students beyond the third grade who are still learning decoding don't have to practice with books like this. And just to zoom out a little bit, the personal experience in my classroom at the time felt more like an anomaly, but it turned out not to be a niche issue. And this actually we should update, because the 2024, which came out in early 2025, NAEP results, 69% of fourth graders, so the number went down, and 60, I think it's maybe 70% of eighth graders. So more than 2/3 of fourth and eighth graders today are not reading proficiently. They lack the skills they need where they should be. And once you hit that fourth grade point, you're expected to be able to read, so you can read to learn. And so there's no instruction typically in schools on how to learn to read at that point, because we think you will have mastered it in K through 3. And so the problem compounds at that point, sort of like, what do I do from a learning perspective? But also the books written at a second grade level are written for second graders, and the books written at a fourth grade level are written for fourth graders. And so there's this gap when it comes to sort of mismatched age or interest level with skill level. So yes, Storyshares, we thought a lot about, how do we make new books for all the students who need a different kind of book to be able to strengthen their literacy skills. So just this high level on Storyshares, that's our goal, is to make sure that all students have a pathway to literacy no matter where they are, and that libraries are filled with books that provide choices for not just avid readers, but striving readers, and that not only are the book choices available, but people know how to navigate them. And so that's everyone from teachers who are working with, we hear all the time from teachers who say, I came to teach literature in middle school, but so many of my students can't read, and I have to teach literacy first, but I have no idea how to do that. But also parents and librarians, how do you, navigate the disconnect between ability level and interest level, and help students hone in on books that are right for them. So that is our goal, is to allow every student to be able to fall in love with the book and to become a reader. And in order to do that, we have to think differently about the kinds of books we're creating for those students who are still learning to read. Okay, and so Shira, I think just because I've been talking a lot, I'll let you do like a 30-second. We're not going to talk about just Storyshares the whole time, but just contextualizing for everybody.
Yeah, so one of the things that Louise mentioned is that there are, and I'll speak to my own experience. I was one of those teachers. I was trained in secondary English education, and I arrived in my first middle school classroom, and I had a group of students who sat in the back who could not sound out single syllable words. And I totally panicked. And my path was to then use that. I used that experience. I had a lot of resources through my district. I became a dyslexia specialist. That is not everyone's path. And we view it as our responsibility as a publisher, and then also as we develop curricular materials, that we are not just supporting those students, we're also supporting the educators who work with those students. And we use the term educator versus the term teacher, because educator encompasses so many people who work with youth. Educator encompasses librarians, parents, family members, teachers, paraprofessionals, tutors. There are so many people who, an educator is someone who educates. And so really looking at it in that way is very important for us. And in so doing, we really center professional learning, doing webinars like this one, really looking at the strategies that are evidence-based that can be used and paired with these high interest books because we really think that that is that winning combination, really looking at those structured literacy practices, those evidence-based instructional routines. There are amazing programs that are formed off of those that sometimes don't engage older students because the books are not there as well. So really pairing those with those high interest books to get students excited about reading. So this is what we consider our version of a structured literacy wheel.
Thank you. And just one note on our approach to developing this content. Storyshares is sort of not an accidental company, but we landed on the model that we use for developing books with an experiment where we initially ran a writing contest to see if we could provide guidance and the awareness and tools and some incentives for writers from around the world to craft news stories that are specifically meant for, anyone older than third grade and at a range of more accessible levels, which there's the decodable books, which we'll go deep on, and it takes a little bit more nuance. But some of the what we call, high-low books, high interest, low literacy, it's things that can be as simple as don't use multi-clause sentences, break them into two sentences, avoid idioms if it comes to newcomers and multilingual learners, like figurative language that's hard to grasp, more accessible vocabulary. So we threw out a bunch of guidance and provided some tools and wanted to see what stories could be generated. And that first contest was so amazing because there are just so many writers out there, authors, aspiring authors, parents who have children with dyslexia and have been rewriting things, teachers who are crafting their own books in their own classrooms and who want readers and are able to be creative, as writers, of course, are, to tweak some of the approaches to make this slightly different kind of book, featuring older characters and themes that older kids care about, but slightly simpler language. And so that contest ultimately resulted in so many amazing stories that, of course, we always winnow. They're not all amazing, but you get to hone in on the really great ones and then refine them. And also this model of developing a community of content creators and being able to consistently hear from the classroom or the library, we need this kind of book, and be able to engage our community of writers in a crowdsourcing way to craft news stories that meet any kind of needs for the students that are learning to read. So that's kind of the core of our model. And, we'll talk mostly about decodable chapter books in this presentation, but and those require one extra layer of nuance when it comes to phonics editing and all of that. But essentially, this is a community-powered book collection. And what that brings is really amazingly diverse and authentic voices we have over 180 countries represented in the authors that we've published through Storyshares. So from so many different contexts and backgrounds and identities, experiences, which is a powerful piece of connection when it comes to reading for our students who also have such a range of identities. So, okay. We're going to talk about, as I mentioned, kind of 4 key pieces from a research perspective. So we'll dive into that now. The first is the science of reading, which most of you have probably heard of. We'll just quickly talk about the components there. And then we'll talk about the power of choice and identity. And then I'm already forgetting the first one. Oh yeah, practice. Okay, so right, science of reading, practice, choice, and reader identity. Those are the 4 pieces we're going to weave together, much like Scarborough's rope. So Shira, I will let you dive into the science of reading.
So this is probably a fairly familiar image to a lot of the folks here, but this is Scarborough's rope. I've also heard it referred to as Scarborough's braid. And it is all of the different strands of literacy that have to work in tandem at the exact same time when reading is increasingly strategic and increasingly automatic. It forms skilled reading. And so it's weaving together all of this information about language comprehension, building schema and vocabulary, and understanding of language structures, verbal reasoning, knowledge of literacy. So really looking at genre, looking at informational text structures, all of those different, the kinds of things that skilled readers stop thinking about. And that is, I think, like that was a huge moment that I had as an educator when I was like, wait a second, I'm doing these things, but I don't think about but I don't think about them. So how do I communicate that to students who do need to think about them until they become automatic? And strategic, and then pairing that with the word recognition piece. So looking at phonological awareness, decoding and encoding, and sight recognition. And then there is like a huge thing that's missing from Scarborough's rope, which is why there is now a new rope. There's a writing rope that is out there, but it's also looking at writing. Have yet to come across a striving reader who does not also need additional support with writing. So at Storyshares, something that's very important in all of our work is that we always have scaffolded written response to reading that pairs with our texts to really support students in that way. Anyways, that is all to say that the science of reading, as I'm sure you all know, is a body of research that has been formed over the past 40 years and is continuing to form and evolve and change every day. And it is not a pedagogy, it's not a set of practices, but they inform pedagogies and practices. So the decodable chapter books that we are going to talk about and best practices for teaching decoding and best practices for working with decodable and high interest lower level books, those all come from practices that were formed using the science of reading as a research basis. And one of the umbrella terms for that set of practices is structured literacy, which we will talk about too.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. And so, the science of reading, some of you have maybe heard Sold a Story kind of like burst onto the scene several years ago with the Sold a Story podcast. And initially it was very clearly associated with phonics instruction, which is, the decodables piece. And it's, as Shira mentioned, it's all of these components that have to happen at once that, all of us as fluent readers, proficient readers, we just do them. We read a book, you're figuring out what the words say, you're also processing what they mean from a vocabulary perspective and how they string together, and it's all automatic. But for my kids who are in early elementary school, they're being taught these pretty discreetly, and they need each of these structured building blocks ideally as a foundation for them being able to read really fluently and read to learn. And if you think about what happens if you're an older student who's missing some of these puzzle pieces, it's you don't have the luxury that in kindergarten my daughter has, where you get to have the different components more systematically taught in isolation. They have to all happen together. And so that's one of the nuances that goes into learning to read as an older student that we'll share a little more about. So science of reading is basically using research and evidence-based practices to teach reading, and there are many of them on each strand. The science of practice, as we're calling it, is something that feels very intuitive, but I think is often missing from the reading conversation. And as librarians and parents here, you all probably, I know I have some teachers, but actually like deeply feel and know this already, but often within the schools, there's such a focus on skill development and standards and progress and assessment that the practice piece sometimes gets, it becomes a second thought, or whatever the word is for that. And I think it's fascinating because in most other things, it's like so assumed that in order to become proficient or fluent or, to master something, you have to practice it to get to the next level. But within reading intervention, sometimes it's a very clear focus on each discrete skill. And then there aren't books that pair with that skill that students can read to practice and strengthen it and deepen it, and then to be able to scaffold up to the next skill. Maybe it's passages, or, the books are this. And so there's not engaged practice. And so, I often talk about, if you're learning to play a guitar, you do need the notes. You need to know the notes, but you're never going to become a guitar player just by knowing the notes. You have to practice and play the guitar and try different songs. And so one of the big things that we spend so much of our time thinking about at Storyshares is pairing books that give really engaged and meaningful practice opportunities with skill levels, so that students can deepen those skills and then scaffold up to the next level. So that is a really crucial component, and one that becomes surprisingly difficult if you don't have books that students can read and want to read, and therefore can use for practice. And again, as fluent readers, we all still know the experience of reading a book that's either not engaging or where you're distracted, and you can read the words and then realize like you read a whole page and you have no idea what just happened, right? And so practice is not the experience of just reading words or looking at a book. It has to be engaged. And for older students, that means it has to be engaging and it has to be accessible. And so, that's what we think a lot about. How do you enable and empower practice that meets students where they are and gives them meaningful opportunities to go deeper with those reading skills. So I sort of do spontaneous stuff, but you get this context as the background to my spiel. And right alongside that is the power of choice. And the power of choice, just like the power of practice, can't be understated, because it is such a different experience for especially teenagers or preteens to say to them, you have to read this, versus even you could read this or this, or you could, the beauty of libraries, you can look at this shelf and pick out anything you want to read. And like that is such a joyful experience, right? Like, look at this shelf. You can pick out anything you want to read, versus like, you have to read this. And the thing about our students, those students who get to middle school, high school, and struggle with reading, is that they don't get that experience because they don't have that many choices that meet them at their intersection. And so, that is it's a barrier. Whereas if we can offer, sometimes it's even just, right, you have two choices and a student picks one. They already feel more engaged. They already feel more connected to it because they had some agency in choosing it. That alone does a little bit of shifting, right, on the social emotional level. And then if they end up connecting with that book and saying this, oh yeah, this character kind of reminds me of myself, or, I also love cooking or soccer, then that's another shift. And that goes from, I'm not a reader. I don't really like reading. Reading is boring. Reading is not for me, or reading is too hard to, these characters remind me of myself. I feel seen and heard. I want to go back and look for other choices, and I can read. I am a reader. And even, our favorite thing is hearing from teachers, like when students say, like, I finished that book, and, do you have another one like that? Because that's actually a transformation when the student goes from not wanting to read to wanting another book. And so, the power of choice is a really fundamental piece of of inspiring everyone, but especially adolescents, because, you know, adolescence is a tough time, and feeling like you have some autonomy goes a very, very long way. So that is our third piece. And I'm gonna let Shira talk about the fourth, and then we'll weave this all together into the books themselves.
So when we talk about the ways that we want students to access text and to feel represented by the text that they read, as well as to feel that they have a choice in what they're reading, I didn't realize that what I was talking about that whole time was literary presence until I read this really phenomenal book by Goldie Muhammad called Cultivating Genius, which is an equity framework for what she refers to as historically responsive literacy. And she draws on not just decades, but centuries of literacy research, and looks at literary societies that have formed in this country among oppressed groups in this country. And it's just a really fascinating way to think about how young people can have agency with the books that they read and with the education surrounding those books. So her framework for literary presence really looks at creating context for students to share their voices and visions through acts of reading, writing, and speaking. So when we talk about some of the instructional routines that pair with books for older striving readers, we're looking at those three different types of opportunities. So opportunities for oral language development through speaking and conversation, and opportunities to get that practice through reading. And then also those writing opportunities, both for students to respond to what they're reading, but also, and we talk about this a lot, Storyshares, because Storyshares did start with that contest model, really looking at writing as a way to complete that literacy cycle. So first, we are giving students books that they can read, and then students are understanding what they're reading. They're making connections back to their own lives. And then we're empowering students to write the kinds of books that they want to read as well. So really looking at writing as closing that loop. And then we also are looking at texts that speak to students' multiple identities instead of selecting text based on their reading identities alone. Older striving readers often have, yes, exactly. Like they often have identities that are not, they have a reading identity already. It might not be positive, but it's still a reading identity. They might have an identity that is not that of an older striving reader. It might be that of an older struggling reader or of a kid who can't read. They've had a lot of time to develop those identities. And often those identities have been reinforced in a variety of ways. So if they come across one of the books that Louise just showed that speaks to their identity that is not necessarily associated with a growth mindset, that might be an identity that where they feel like they struggle or that they can't learn, then they don't have the resources that they need to succeed. But if they get a text that is written at a skill level that they can read, as they are scaffolding up their skills, as they're developing those skills, and that speaks to their identity, maybe as someone who loves video games or as someone who is really interested in being the cap, like I think it's captain. I'm not a basketball player, but in
Yeah.
like running up their basketball team.
Yeah.
If I'm thinking about some of the characters in our books who are based off like the lived experiences of teenagers, like if they are getting a book that speaks to those identities as well, they're able to be present with what they're reading in ways that they aren't necessarily when they're reading something that was not created with them in mind. And then this is something that, older students, as I'm sure you all know and have experienced, like they are very, very, very good at saying when something was not, at rejecting something that was not made with them in mind. Um, and at knowing it and at sussing it out and figuring it out. So we really do want to look at those reading experiences, not just the books, but the whole experience that centers their experience, that centers their lived experience as well. And we're going to take a kind of hard pivot, but it is going to make sense, I promise, to the
Yeah,
decodables of it
and
all. Yeah, go for
well, and
it.
just to add to that, those of us who love reading, which I'm guessing most of us here do, it's just like being a human in general, which is you feeling connection is such an important and powerful thing to feel, and feeling seen and heard and connected, right? And so for older students, like their identity with reading is often they have by that point felt really disconnected from it. And so that creates a barrier again versus a first grader who's like, yay, book. Okay, what do I do with this? And they start they don't have any loaded, they don't have any baggage around it. And so for those students that do have baggage, our society currently, most of it at least, there is not anyone here I know, but there's a tendency to say, well, we teach reading in K3 and it's too late for you at those older age. Like that is what we're currently doing, so far. I do believe the tides will turn, but right now it's like we don't know how to teach reading then. And there's so many barriers. We don't have the right books. The teachers aren't trained for it. And it's hard, right? It's really hard. It's hard to teach reading anyway, even to an eager, early elementary kid, but it's really hard to like an angsty teenager who's like, I don't know, this has always been negative for me. And so what we have found really fascinating is the power of making those students through a book, which again, we all know that experience, I'm sure, feel seen and heard. Like, oh, that experience that character is having, like, that reminds me of that thing I just went through. And it's almost like a friend, right? When you find that kind of book. And that is powerful enough to, plus all the instructional pieces, overcome some of those negative, because you have one book like that and suddenly you're like, oh, okay, this isn't like so horrible. I thought it was like really always 100% horrible. You can start transforming it, but it's hard. It's harder, much harder. So that is, what we're tackling every day. Okay, so we are going to shift into, decodables and decoding. And since it's already 2:42, sure, we can just talk quickly about the research on decoding, and then we'll talk about our journey with decodables for older students, which initially we were told was totally impossible. You could never make a book like this that a teenager would want to read. And so we're excited to share what we came up with.
So I'll just quickly go through some of the research on decoding, and then we'll kind of talk about, as Louise mentioned, how this is relevant for older students who are still working on this foundational skill. I thought this number was way higher when I was in the classroom, but it is not. Only 13% of English words are not decodable. I would tell my students all the time, English is a really tricky language because so many of the words are not decodable. Part of that sentence is true. English is a really tricky language. It is not necessarily because so many words are not decodable. It's because there's a lot of code to learn. There are a lot of strategies to learn. There are a lot of phonics rules embedded in the English language. But when students do know those rules, they are able, and those rules and patterns, they are then able to decode the vast majority of words that they will encounter, which greatly decreases their cognitive load as they are learning to read. Go to the next slide.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was like, next.
No worries. I animate these. And then connecting this all back to the science of practice. When beginners read decodable books, they apply their knowledge of grapheme phonemes, so letter sound correspondences, and they're able to demonstrate their decoding. So teaching students the rules and patterns without giving them opportunities to practice does not translate to more fluent automatic reading. What it does is they then know the rules. But the end game is to actually give them books that they can read and that they can love. And any book is a decodable book for people who can decode it. So that means that the 8th book in our decodable series is not going to be decodable for someone who is still learning consonant and vowel consonant sounds. It's not a decodable book for them. It also means that for me, like, I'm looking at my bookshelf. Little Women is a decodable book because I can decode it. So it's looking at it with kind of that layer of nuance that what's decodable for one person might not be decodable for another person. And that is the relevance and power of a scope and sequence.
Yeah, and sorry, just to add to that, like on the flip side too. So, if you learn decoding, the keys, right, like the code, but you don't have the opportunity to practice it, you don't deepen or strengthen it. On the flip side, if you're practicing without knowing the code, it's like, you have like a whole ring full of keys and a door with a lock, and you don't know how to unlock it. And so that's why decodable books are a big thing right now, especially in early elementary school, because the students that I'm pretty sure I wasn't taught decoding because I'm a terrible speller. Like if you don't have those initial building blocks, you are tackling a new journey, right? A new battle each time. Whereas if you can build those patterns and they are codes, you can unlock new things. So anyway, we have a tendency to go too deep on this stuff. So yeah, this is Shira.
Yeah, so just so quickly, the practice with decodable text leads to reading accuracy and fluency. And the one missing piece of this puzzle is comprehension, but there is a plethora of research out there on fluency that shows that reading fluency leads to comprehension, and knowledge building. So we can make that connection in the research as well.
Yeah, and comprehension, which is, that's another piece of the puzzle. And it's one of the pieces that, I feel pretty strongly about, because my students actually could decode, but then they could read you something perfectly. It sounded really great. And then you'd say, okay, so tell me what that was about. And they'd be like, no idea what I just read. So that's where the strands come in. It has to all happen in parallel. But if you don't have the decoding piece, you're missing that foundational level. And so, the science of reading came out, it became a thing. There's a lot of focus on decoding and decodable books. And now, as librarians and parents, you've probably seen there are so many different decodable publishers and decodable books for kindergarten through third grade. And why are they all for kindergarten through third grade? Well, because that's when you learn to read. That's when teachers are teaching reading. That's when students are learning to read. And so there are tons of them, and they look like this, are the ones I've been showing. The problem is that so many students still can't decode in 4th through 12th grade, and because we weren't teaching it actually for several decades. So that adds a whole new layer to the challenge, as we've talked about. The texts don't give a pathway to literacy. The training, the teachers don't know how to teach it in those grades, let alone like the tradition or the structures we have in place. There's no reading block. There's intervention blocks, but there's no reading time. And so it's a whole different journey to think about how to teach, how to provide decodable books for older students. But we heard over and over again from teachers, librarians, parents, we need books that are decodable books for 5th graders or 7th graders or 9th graders. And, this is what we're offering them. And so, as I mentioned, that it felt like, how could you make a book like this that a older student would want to read? And so we spent a lot of time playing with that and landed on what, I'm going to skip through this because of timing, but we talked about this, right? Like the reason we want to use the decodable text is when you can do something independently, you feel capable. And so if I give a book like Little Women to a student who can't decode, like that makes them feel horrible, right? And they don't read it and they don't think of themselves as a reader. If you give that same student a book that isn't embarrassing and is engaging, but that they can read independently, or at least almost independently, and then continue to improve with, they feel capable and empowered. And so that's the importance of being able to offer decodable text, where students can access most of the words independently and start to feel that empowerment. So a lot of different reasons why students might not be able to decode in the older grades. Students with dyslexia or language-based learning differences, multilingual learners, newcomers. And then again, as I mentioned, we actually weren't teaching decoding for many decades until the past several years. It was balanced literacy, and so they weren't learning those codes. And so huge numbers of students weren't taught that. And then again, like low-income communities, underserved communities more broadly, often don't get that core foundational instruction in the early years, and then those gaps continue to perpetuate. So when we started thinking about decodable text for older students, we thought a lot about why would a 6th grader not want to read this, and what does it look like to offer them something they might want to read. And so we just honed in on a few key pieces. I'm going to flip these slightly, that are crucial for older students. To look and feel like a YA book. So this, I'm going to show you like in real time, and we can send some links afterwards. This is one of our decodable books. So the first main thing we did is we anthologized decodable texts. So we made each decodable text a chapter in a longer book so that it looks more like the books their peers are reading. This is basically like 5 decodable texts in one book. And then, yeah, we did like such simple things, like we changed the shape to make it look more like a standard novel. We used photographs and older students instead of line drawings, right? And, floating heads. And then we also played with the inside vibe. So each of the decodable chapters is along, which Shira can talk about more, a scope and sequence where there are skills of focus, just like this has. Each of these has a specific sound or skill of focus, but they are several chapters within one book and they build on each other along a scope and sequence. And then the book itself looks, it doesn't feel like it was made for a baby. We play with a lot of different graphic elements that are more engaging to teenagers, even like some comic book type vibes. And by doing this, we are able to address the same structured and controlled phonics skills, but in a way that not only looks and feels more engaging to an older student, but actually like the content itself, we can still tell big stories, powerful, relevant stories for an older student with simpler language. And so that is the high level of what these decodable chapter books are, which I'll go back to this. We started initially with the middle school series and then developed a high school and a late elementary series. And then since then, we've done a lot of interdisciplinary development as well, thinking about how do you make decodable books that also provide American history background knowledge or concepts in science or STEM, that those students who need both to learn how to read, but also how to access grade level science content can do both at once. So yeah, sure, I'll let you jump in, but this is the decodable chapter book is the high level outcome here.
Yeah, and I shared an example of the first book of our first decodable series in the chat, but really kind of going off this idea and just truth that older students know when something is not created with them in mind. We flipped that and we really tried to create books that really kept them in mind, and that meant creating them for different age groups as well. So really focusing on making something that was very specific to the experiences and the knowledge building curricula in late elementary, making something that felt very specific to middle school students and high school students. And I'll just say that these are different in several ways from, in addition to the ones that Louise shared, from decodables for younger students. We are doing our best. The Institute for Education Sciences has recommendations for literacy intervention for grades 4 through 9. And those recommendations do involve introducing multisyllabic decoding earlier. So there are multisyllabic words that come up earlier on in our decodables than they would in others. Same with high frequency words that students who've been exposed to text would know faster than students who are encountering text for one of the first times. So this is, yeah, sorry, Louise, go for it.
Oh no, I was just gonna say like the Bob books, which are very popular, and again, like worked for a little while with my kids, the early side of things, they have a whole book for the question mark, right? They introduced that because like when you're in preschool, like the question mark is a new thing. But a 7th grader might not be able to read, but they know what a question mark looks like, right? And so we get to sort of be a little creative in how we address decodables and sort of that staggered entry point for older students. So yeah, sure. Keep going.
But along those lines, we are using a constantly spiraling phonics scope and sequence. So students are getting all of these different phonics skills and rules and patterns in a way that constantly spirals. So once they are learning vowel teams and R controlled vowels, they have also learned all of the skills that build up to that. And the book that features vowel teams and R controlled vowels includes all of those other skills as well, so that they're really building on that practice piece. But I really want to get to the next slide because I think that's like the juiciest
Okay, yeah, and
for
I
the
was going to mention
decodables.
the
Go for it.
this
Yes.
just quickly because a lot of times I think like again for a librarian or parent or even a ninth grade ELA teacher, they're like, I don't know what schwa means or two sound blends or like I didn't until Sharon came along, and so figuring out what it means and how to leverage it and where to begin. And so just as a quick point, and we'll go deeper on it in the next slide, but we've made some of these like educator, to Cher's point, companions, which are about everything from like the knowledge around teaching reading to students who are still learning to decode to also like book by book, like instead of having to read a whole 8-book series to engage with a child on that series, here's some of the core questions that come up in each book and the vocabulary to talk about quickly beforehand. So, and where to hone in, how to know where to begin with the book. So that's something which we obviously can't go deep on right now, but if anyone's interested, we can share lots of thoughts in the future. Okay, go for it, Shira.
So I just want to be mindful of time and we do have to wrap up soon. We can send something if that's okay, Marion and Beth, to folks who participated that really has a breakdown of different strategies for teaching with decodable texts, looking at pre-reading, reading, and after reading routines. To really leverage the experience of reading decodable texts. I do want to give folks an opportunity to ask questions. So I will try to drop something in the chat to this end.
Yeah, and this is some of the things that anyone can do when it comes to like, okay, I have this book and someone who needs to learn how to read, and how do I support them with it? And
So,
so, yeah.
Louise and Shira, I mean, we're happy to go over an hour, but I want to be mindful if people need to leave and drop, we will certainly get, the information out. So everybody, you are welcome to stay on and continue the conversation, and if you need to go, we will understand. But back to you, and there is a comment in the chat that I would like to talk about. Maybe the middle school covers look good, the late elementary and high school books look less like the popular read-alikes the kids want. And it's hard as a public librarian to help a child who's already reluctant overcome the first impression of the cover. I mean, I don't, Mary, do you want to give us some examples of
Is
the
it
books
because
that
of
you're
like
finding?
the top and the bottom?
Yeah, hi. I don't want to necessarily take up the last 2 minutes here, but just a little bit of feedback. Yeah, to look at what's super popular and the commonalities of those covers. Yeah, and just even like font choices and that kind of thing. They do look like a institutional book rather than a trade book to me, and I know the kids can sniff that out too.
Yeah. Well, no, thank you for that feedback. Pretty sure we just made like, so we had the same reaction. For example, the high school ones, we just made new versions with smaller font because the font felt too big. So we love that kind of feedback. We are very iterative in the way that we develop content. All of this started as an experiment, and then the only way we make it better and make more content that really meets the needs of the teachers and students we're trying to serve is by getting that feedback and then evolving it from there. So yeah, feel free to reach out afterwards. I totally know what you mean as far as like some of those additional elements that these feel a little more blended. So that's an important piece. It's a fun journey because it's impossible not to look at it and then realize, oops, we should do that next time and this next time. So we love feedback. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so we don't need to go deep on here. We can share this PowerPoint too, since we had to go quickly at the end. Any other, like, I think, I actually don't have a lot of extra minutes, but if there's time for maybe like one more question, and then maybe we could do a follow-up session at some point for going deeper from here.
Yeah, we'd love to do a follow-up, I think, at some point, and take what everybody's learned today and give those who weren't able to attend time to watch the recording. And then, yeah, we would love to follow up on all of this. I know this demographic is certainly one that we hear about a lot, so it's really good to have these conversations about how we can serve them, especially at the library and parents. Yes, we love being able to partner with you, with Storyshares, and we love to bring these into our libraries.